This is a 2004 Maserati Coupe, and it is an unbelievable bargain. This car is currently listed for sale for just $20,000. Actually, $19,995, meaning it's a modern Maserati sports car for the price of a Toyota Yaris. And while most of these came with this horrible sequential automatic transmission that was just unreliable and terrible to use, this one has a manual transmission, which makes it far more desirable. And today, I'm going to review it. I've borrowed this Maserati Coupe from WS Auto Sales, which is a car dealership here in San Diego that has a fantastic inventory of weird and unusual vehicles, everything from pristine 1980s and 90s Toyotas to manual transmission BMW SUVs. I love their quirky cars, and you can check out WS by clicking the link in the description below. So let's talk Maserati Coupe. This car was sold here in North America from 2002 to 2006, although it was called the Grand Sport in its final model year. This car is the predecessor to the Maserati Gran Turismo, and the idea is the same. A nice-looking two-door, four-seat Maserati you could use for performance driving or for grand touring. Maserati also sold a two-door convertible version of this car that they called the Spider. Under the hood, the Coupe has a 4.2-liter V8 that makes 385 horsepower and about 330 pound-feet of torque, an engine that was derived from the V8 used in the Ferrari F430. Unfortunately, most Maserati Coupe models used a terrible automatic transmission called Cambio Corsa, which was a sequential manual unit that was horrible to use and incredibly unreliable. It was the hot new thing at the time, but it has aged terribly. About 85% of Maserati Coupe models have Cambio Corsa, but this one has a true 6-speed manual. And it's also cheap. Like all Maserati models, this car has lost value quickly and significantly, and now it's priced under $20,000 with just 39,000 miles. So today I'm going to show you around this car, which might just be the most car you can get for 20 grand. First, I'm going to show you all of the interesting quirks and features, then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Maserati Coupe in the most important place, and that would be the transmission. You can see this car has a true 6-speed manual transmission, which was very rare and a huge improvement over the terrible Cambio Corsa automatic, jerky, unreliable transmission that most of these cars had. I'll talk more about Cambio Corsa during the driving portion of this video. One interesting thing about the manual transmission in this car is that the leather shift boot appears to have like a wart in it. Part of it is up a little higher than the rest of it. Interestingly, this is not just a problem with this car, this is how all of them were built. And I've never really understood why the left bottom half of the shift boot kind of comes up like it has a growth. It's really strange, but that's how they made them for some reason. And speaking of leather boots, let's talk about the parking brake boot, which is also interesting. You can see it's at the bottom of the parking brake, and the notable thing is that it's not just stitched on there, instead it's velcroed on. And you can just remove the velcro and then remove this little snap that's also there and remove the parking brake boot. Not exactly the highest quality thing when you look down and see velcro there, but that's what Maserati chose to do. And next up, another thing that Maserati chose to do in order to save money in this car was mount the window switches in the middle. In most cars, you have window switches on the driver's door and then the passenger window switch on the passenger door, but Maserati put them in the middle so they wouldn't have to make different doors for left-hand drive and right-hand drive, which would save them a lot of money. And that's why the window switches are in the middle of this car. Now, often you see power mirror controls mounted on the driver's door, but again, Maserati did didn't want to do that because then they would have to make different driver's doors for left-hand drive and right-hand drive. So the power mirror controls are also in the middle. You can see them here. It's sort of weird to have the focal point in the center of this luxury sports car interior be the mirror controls, but that's what happened so that Maserati could save some cash. And next up, also in the middle and worth noting, next to the mirror controls, you have the cup holder. I say that singular because there is just one cup holder in this car. 4 seats, 2 front seats, 1 cup holder. If your passenger wants to put their drink somewhere, too bad. And next up, moving back to the center control stack near the shifter, you can see there are 5 buttons directly above the shifter, some of which are kind of interesting. For one, there's a blank, and Maserati chose the blank to be the button nearest to the driver, which is always an interesting decision. But there are other interesting buttons up there too. For example, there's a button marked MSP with a slash through it. This is the button you press if you really do not want to go to the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. No, actually it turns off the Maserati stability program, which is Maserati's version of stability control. You also have a sport button over there. You press it and then sport turns on. I drove this car a little bit earlier, pressed the sport button and noticed no discernible change, but the placebo effect of being in sport mode is always a good thing. And next up, another interesting item in the center of the dashboard in this car, you have an analog clock, the mark of a true luxury automobile. One other interesting center item is between the seats in the center console. You have this storage area, but if you open it up, you'll see it's like the smallest center storage area ever. In some cars, these things are like 6-10 inches deep. In this, it's like an inch, which leads one to wonder what exactly is going on underneath here that they couldn't make this larger. No one knows. But fortunately, the center storage area isn't the only storage you have in this car. You also have a glove box. One interesting item is on the outside of the glove box. You can see it says Coupe GT, or Coupe GT if you prefer. That's what Maserati called the manual transmission version of this car. If you got an automatic, the glove box would say Coupe Cambio Corsa, but the manuals were called the GT, but that's one way to distinguish them. And even though nobody remembers that distinction, if you're talking about the Maserati Coupe GT, technically you are only referring to the manual version of this car. Anyway, open up the glove box and you'll see nothing particularly interesting as far as storage, just a regular glove box, but there are 2 buttons in there. One pops open the fuel door, the other pops open the trunk. They're in the glove box because the theory is you could lock the glove box to prevent valets from accessing it, and then valets won't have access to your trunk, and they also won't be able to put fuel in your Maserati. And next up, another interesting interior item is the sun visors. You drop the passenger side sun visor and you can see there's a visor mirror and lights like you'd expect. You drop the driver's side sun visor and you can see there's an airbag warning label. Now, a lot of automakers figure out a way to get the airbag warning label on there in addition to a visor mirror, but not Maserati. Apparently it was one or the other. So in this car, only the passenger can drop the visor and look at themselves. And next up, we move on to the gauge cluster in the Maserati Coupe, which I've always felt has a pretty good look to it. This almost looks like a vintage gauge cluster, certainly like an old school sports car design, and I've always felt they really nailed it with the look of the gauge cluster in this car. With that said, there are a few interesting gauge cluster quirks and features in this car, starting with the little screen at the bottom center of the gauge cluster. Now, if you have an automatic Maserati Coupe, that screen shows what gear you're in and also the temperature, but if you have a manual car, the gear feature is disabled, so it only shows the temperature and only in the bottom third of the screen. Instead of creating a new screen with a larger temperature display, they've decided to only utilize a small portion of the screen and leave the rest blank. And next up, right above that screen, you have a little graphic of the car from the top down. It's intended to show when your doors are open. And you can see when you open a door, it doesn't show like a door open. Instead, a little red line appears where that door would be. It's the same story with the hood or the trunk or whatever else you might open in this car. Instead of actual door open graphics appearing, you just get a little red line corresponding to whatever piece is open. It's kind of interesting. Next up, another interior item worth noting in here is the headliner, which I find to be absolutely beautiful. I don't find this interior to be particularly nice or cheap. It's just kind of average for a car like this, but the headliner I think is gorgeous. I love the stitched look. I love these stitched lines through it. It gives it this kind of vintage, high quality feel. And next we move on to the back seat in the Maserati Coupe. Yes, this car has a back seat, and getting in is no easy task. To start, you pull these little latches on the front seat, push the backrest forward, and then the seat automatically whirs forward to give you more room so you can climb in back. This process takes a little while. Then you actually climb in back, which is not especially easy, and then you're here. And I have to say, once you're in the back of this car, the rear bucket seats are pretty tight and pretty narrow. You can see these are not wide, flat seats. You kind of have to squeeze into them, and you don't really have much legroom either. Not exactly what you'd expect for a grand touring vehicle. But what about the other luxuries in the back seat, you might be wondering? Well, good question. There is an armrest. You can put it down and rest your arm. You also have in between the seats a small velvet storage area, and right next to that, another small velvet storage area. That screams true luxury grand touring vehicle. And to top things off, back here you also have coat hooks. You can push them down from the ceiling and then you can hang your coat, which again, very luxurious. No, I'm just kidding. I'm actually surprised by the relative lack of amenities back here. For a grand touring car, this is not a place I would want to spend a grand tour or even an hour. And by the way, one other interesting thing about the back seats is that the convertible version of this car didn't have them. The coupe was a 4-seater, but the convertible was only a 2-seater. In fact, the convertible was 8 or 9 inches shorter than the coupe in length. So they were basically two different cars that happened to look the same. And when you compare the two next to each other, you can see that the convertible version didn't have room for back seats. There's less space between the doors and the rear wheels in the convertible model. It was a physically smaller car. You don't see that very often, where the coupe and convertible have different wheelbases and lengths and number of seats, but it was the case here. And next up we move on to the outside of the Maserati Coupe, and I'm going to start with the taillights, which might not seem like anything special, but that's a shame. Most Americans don't know this, but the Maserati Coupe was actually an evolution of an earlier version of this car, which was called the Maserati 3200 GT. That car was never sold in North America, but it did have some very cool taillights. They called them Boomerang Taillights. It was like this thin strip that kind of curved around the side of the car like a boomerang. When Maserati revised the car to have it become the Coupe, they started selling it in North America. The Boomerang taillights went away, and instead we got these normal taillights. And next up, another notable exterior item with this car is the fuel door. You can see it right there. It's kind of at the top of the rear fender next to the glass, which is an odd placement for the fuel door. It's very high up compared to most cars, and when you're putting the fuel in, you have to make sure you don't drip over any bodywork, which is not ideal. Kind of a strange spot. And next up, a few other noteworthy items on the outside of this car. One is the key, and you can see it's like blue and light gray, even though this car is like dark gray with a black interior. Clearly this was not an attempt at color matching. Instead, all of these cars had blue keys. At the time, Maserati was trying to like make blue their color, and so all of the Maserati coupes had blue keys like this. It was rather unusual. Another unusual thing about the key is that you have two buttons on it. You have a button for the trunk opener, and then you have a button with dots on it. That is the lock-unlock button. Why did they go with dots instead of a picture of a lock? We may never know. And next up, let's press that trunk opener button on the key to get into the trunk. And when you open it up, you can see there's not really anything particularly noteworthy back here, except for the fact that a lot of the trunk space is taken up by this aftermarket stereo equipment, as you would expect from a cheap, used Maserati. One interesting thing about the trunk, though, is that even if this thing wasn't in here, it's a pretty small trunk for a car like this, a grand touring car. There's not much space back here, and you can't fold down the seats in case you have a larger item to stick inside. It's an unusually tiny trunk, and frankly, it's a lot smaller than I was expecting. But anyway, closing the trunk and moving on to a discussion of the general exterior styling of this car. When this car first came out, I thought it was beautiful. I loved sort of the simple, clean look of it, a lot less aggressive and daring and unattractive as the Maserati models that came later. But over time, I have to say this design is now starting to look dated. Maybe it was too simple and clean and not exciting enough. I will say I vastly prefer the look of the convertible version of this car, the Maserati Spider with its shorter wheelbase. To me, the Coupe always looked like kind of a stretched out long wheelbase version. It never quite looked as good. And finally, we move under the hood in the Maserati Coupe, and this is undoubtedly the most beautiful part of the car. Look at this engine. Absolutely gorgeous with the Maserati logo right there in the center, and the sides say Maserati in the typical script. The colors are beautiful. Everything is gorgeous in here. 385 horsepower, about 330 pound-feet of torque, and like I mentioned before, Ferrari-derived engine from the V8 in the F430. There are not too many $20,000 cars that have a Ferrari-derived engine or an engine this beautiful at all. And so those are the quirks and features of the Maserati Coupe. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Maserati Coupe. I have never driven one of these with a manual transmission, although I had a summer job at a Ferrari dealer like when I was a teenager, and I drove a few of the automatics. First impression, I am shocked at how tight the pedal box is. Really insane. You expect that from like a Countach or like an 80s Ferrari, not like a GT car. Clearly this was intended to be a vehicle that had an automatic transmission. One thing I always liked about this car, even the automatics, was the amount of ready power they had. From the outside, this looks like a kind of a beautiful, pretty car, and you don't really expect it to have all that much muscle. The Gran Turismo was a much angrier looking car, but it actually did have a pretty good amount of power to it. 385 horses was not a small number then, and it's still pretty good. All right, I'm gonna ring it out here. Whew. It actually hauls. It really, really does. It does not have the sound that modern Maserati models do. That sort of sound experience definitely came later. Now, I keep saying that the automatic was such a terrible transmission, and let me explain. It was a terrible transmission. It was a paddle shifter thing, but it wasn't like a modern dual clutch where it's really smooth. Instead, it was almost indescribably clunky and awful. And every time you shifted gears, the car would lurch like you were driving with a learner driver who didn't know manual and was letting off the clutch way too hard. And it was just a terrible, horrible driving experience. And in addition, that transmission has ended up becoming very unreliable as the years have gone on. And now nobody wants to drive it or maintain it. And so that is absolutely the worst of the worst in terms of transmissions. But at the time, it was the hot, new, cool transmission. You could get this like sequential manual like race cars had, and that was considered to be the cool thing, and so a lot of people did. It does blow me away what a bargain this car has become. I knew it'd get cheap, because all Maseratis get cheap, but I mean, there's one on AutoTrader right now for 12 grand. It has too many miles. This one's only got 39,000. But regardless, you can get these things for not much money. And if you get them right, which means well maintained with the manual, you have a pretty good car on your hands. A fast car. And it wasn't just speed. I also always loved how these things handled. The steering is actually really good. It's tight, it's quick, it steers well. Even 39,000 miles and 15 years later, this car is still pretty tight and pretty precise. Unlike in the Ferrari world where a manual can be, 50 grand more, 100 grand more, depending on the car. These things are about the same money. So you find a manual, you have a more reliable car, and you still get, this is a fast car, like a legitimately fast, actually fast car. It's fun, and the steering is really sharp. I will say, in terms of handling, There is a little bit of body roll. The car is certainly not as flat as like a mid-engine exotic or even like a 911 from this era, but the intent was that this was a little bit more of a GT car. And so that's the Maserati Coupe. This was a horrible car back when it was new, and it cost almost $100,000. But these days, it's a modern Maserati sports car with nice styling and a Ferrari-derived engine for 20 grand. Seems like a bargain. But if you get one, just make sure it has a manual transmission, if you can find it. Anyway, now it's time to give the Maserati Coupe a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, this is a nice looking car and it easily gets a 7 out of 10, though the convertible would probably earn an extra point. Next up, acceleration does 0 to 60 in the low 5-second range and it gets a 5 out of 10. Handling is good, sharp steering, but a bit of weight and body roll and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is good and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is also good, though most people have come to realize Maserati doesn't have the brand name sparkle it once did, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 30 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's fine, nothing excessive, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is about what you'd expect, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is okay. The car is relatively reliable with the manual transmission, but it certainly could be better, and the interior materials were never that great, and they're slowly becoming sticky with age, which is a common issue for these cars, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Value is strong given the performance, the look, the brand name, and just how ridiculously cheap these are, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 25 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 55 out of 100, which places it here against other sporty cars from this era, plus the newer Maserati Gran Turismo. The Coupe basically ties the E46 BMW M3, which makes sense because they have about the same performance and they cost about the same these days, although amazingly I think the Maserati might actually be more reliable, especially if you can find one with the far more desirable 6-speed manual transmission.